Right now, as you're watching this video, the price of building a home in America just went up again. And if you think that doesn't affect you, think again, because whether you're renting, whether you're trying to buy your first home, whether you're a contractor, a flipper, or just someone who wants to do a simple kitchen renovation, what I'm about to tell you is going to hit you right in the wallet. And this is not speculation. This is not some talking head guessing about what might happen. This is happening right now across every single state in this country. And it all traces back to one decision, one claim, one moment when President Donald Trump stood up and essentially told America, we don't need Canada's lumber. We have 300 billion trees. We can do this ourselves. And folks, I need you to understand something. That claim has now officially backfired in the most spectacular and painful way possible for regular, hardworking American families. So buckle up, because in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, exactly how we got here, exactly how much more money is coming out of your pocket because of this, and exactly why the people who were supposed to be protected by these tariffs are the ones screaming the loudest that this needs to stop. So if you care about the future of housing in this country, if you care about your money, if you care about the American dream of owning a home, do me a favor right now, smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because I want to hear from every corner of this nation about how this is affecting you personally. All right, let's get into it. So here's what happened. In March of 2025, President Trump directed the Commerce Department to launch what's called a Section 232 investigation into timber and lumber imports. And for those of you who don't know, Section 232 is a legal tool that allows the president to impose tariffs on imports if they're deemed a threat to national security. National security, remember those words, because they're going to become very important later. So the investigation goes forward. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick leads the probe, and by September 30th, 2025, Trump signs a presidential proclamation imposing a brand new 10% tariff on all imported softwood timber and lumber, plus a 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture. These tariffs took effect on October 14th, 2025. And then here's where it gets even worse. On January 1st, 2026, those tariffs on kitchen cabinets jumped to 50%, and the tariffs on upholstered wooden furniture went up to 30%, and you need to understand this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Canadian softwood lumber was already getting slammed with anti-dumping and countervailing duties totaling about 35%. So when you stack this new 10% Section 232 tariff on top of the existing 35%, Canadian lumber entering the United States is now facing total duties exceeding 45%, 45%. Let that sink in. And the justification for all of this was the national security argument. The Commerce Department claimed that wood products are used in critical functions of the Department of Defense, that they're used for building military infrastructure, housing for military personnel, transporting munitions, and even as a component in missile defense systems and thermal protection for nuclear reentry vehicles. And look, nobody is going to argue that our military doesn't need wood products. That's obvious. But here's the thing that the home builders, the economists, the construction workers, and frankly, anyone with common sense has been saying since day one: the United States does not currently produce enough softwood lumber to meet its own domestic demand, period. That is a fact. And that fact has not changed just because we impose tariffs. Yes, America has 300 billion trees. President Trump himself said in his executive order that America has an abundance of timber resources that are more than adequate to meet our domestic timber production needs. But having trees and having the industrial capacity to turn those trees into the lumber that American builders need are two completely different things. And right now, as of early 2026, U.S. sawmills are operating at just 64% of their potential capacity. That number has actually been dropping steadily since 2017. It hasn't gone up, it's gone down. So we don't have the mill capacity, we don't have the workforce, we don't have the supply chain infrastructure to just flip a switch and replace Canadian lumber overnight. And that is exactly the problem. Now, let me tell you who is getting crushed by this. And it's not who you might think. It's not Canada. Well, Canada is hurting too. But the real victims here are American families, American home buyers, American home builders, and American renters. Because here is what the data actually shows, according to the National Association of Home Builders, which represents the people actually building houses in this country. Tariffs have already added approximately $9,200 to the average cost of a new single-family home. The Center for American Progress published an analysis in December 2025 that put the number even higher. They estimated that tariff-related costs are adding about $17,500 to the cost of every new home being built in America, $17,500. And NBC News did their own independent analysis where they modeled an 1,800 square foot single-family home, cataloged every single construction material, mapped it to import data, and found that tariffs add at least $4,400 just to the materials cost alone. And the industry experts who reviewed that analysis called it conservative because it didn't even include labor costs. And here's the bigger picture that really scares me. The Center for American Progress estimates that these tariff-induced higher building costs will result in 450,000 fewer homes being built over the next 5 years through 2030, 450,000 homes that will not exist in a country that already has a housing shortage measured in the millions. The Brookings Institution calculated that current tariffs will add roughly $30 billion to the costs of investment in residential structures, and about 90% of that cost will fall on the construction of new homes and apartments. This is not a drill, people. This is real. This is happening, and it is making the housing crisis in America dramatically worse. And I want to talk about the irony here because it's almost too painful to believe. On his very first day in office, January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order directing departments and agencies to deliver emergency price relief by pursuing actions to lower the cost of housing and increase housing supply. That was day one: lower housing costs, increase supply. That was the stated goal. And then the tariff policy did the exact opposite. The National Association of Home Builders chairman Carl Harris put it in terms that could not be clearer. He said, this move to raise tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods will have the opposite effect of the president's own housing goals. More than 70% of the imports of two essential materials that home builders rely on, softwood lumber and gypsum, which is used for drywall, come from Canada and Mexico, respectively. And these tariffs increase construction costs and discourage new development, and consumers end up paying for the tariffs in the form of higher home prices. Now, February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court actually ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, does not authorize tariffs, which knocked out a chunk of the broader tariff structure. But here's the thing. The Section 232 tariffs on lumber, they're still standing. Those were imposed under a different legal authority. So the lumber tariffs survived that court ruling. And the Tax Foundation, which has been tracking all of this meticulously, now estimates that the Trump tariffs collectively amount to an average tax increase of about $1,500 per U.S. household in 2026. That's on top of everything else Americans are already paying, on top of already record high home prices, on top of mortgage rates that have made it nearly impossible for first-time buyers to get into the market. Let me bring this down to a personal level so you really understand what this means. In the real world, there was a building materials supplier in Farmingdale, New York, a company called J.C. Ryan. They had a contract to supply wooden doors and frames for an apartment complex in Nassau County. They were getting them from a Canadian company because it cost less than the American equivalent. Half the job was already delivered. But once the tariffs kicked in on the remaining $75,000 worth of materials, the tariff added $19,000 to the at cost total. And after the supplier applied their markup, the customer ended up owing $30,000 more than originally planned. $30,000 on one contract for wooden doors. Or take the story of a contractor in San Diego named Bar Zakhim, who owns a company called Better Place Design and Build that specializes in accessible dwelling units. He said Canada remains the best source for the lumber, but by sticking with imported lumber, he had to raise his prices about 15% compared to a year ago. And he said, quote, "I'm not about to go out of business, but it's looking to be a slow, expensive year for us." And these are real people, real businesses, real Americans who are getting squeezed. And the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, which is the report that examines economic conditions across the country through all 12 regional Fed districts, specifically highlighted concerns from construction contacts about rising lumber prices. 4 of the 12 regional banks, including Richmond, St. Louis, Kansas City, and San Francisco, all referenced worries about higher building material costs. Construction activity has declined. Builders are now inserting escalation clauses into their contracts because they can't even predict what materials will cost from week to week. And lenders are becoming more cautious in their underwriting because of the risk of materials costs blowing up during a project. Now, here is where I need you to really pay attention, because this is the part that the mainstream conversation keeps missing. The people who are getting hurt the worst are not wealthy developers. They're not big corporations. They're the smallest contractors, the local builders, the family-owned construction companies, because the national home builders, the big guys like Toll Brothers and Lennar and DR, Horton, they have long-term supply contracts that insulate them from price shocks, at least for a while. But the small builder, the guy who's building 10 or 15 homes a year in your community, he doesn't have that protection. He's buying materials at current market prices. And when those prices jump because of tariffs, he either has to eat the cost, which he can't afford to do, or he has to pass it to the buyer, which prices more Americans out of the market, or he just stops building. And that's exactly what's happening. Single-family home construction starts in April 2025. We're down 12% compared to April 2024. Builders are pulling back because the math doesn't work anymore. And let me address the elephant in the room, the argument that we should just use American lumber. Look, I am all for domestic production. I am all for American manufacturing. I am all for creating jobs right here at home. But you cannot wish industrial capacity into existence. The United States imports about 1/3 of the lumber it consumes because America does not produce enough. Canada accounts for nearly 85% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports. 85%. That's not a small dependency. That is a structural reality of the North American lumber market that was built over decades. And yes, Trump signed an executive order to expand domestic logging. But experts say it will take years before domestic lumber production can ramp up to meet the needs of American builders. You can't just cut down trees and have lumber tomorrow. You need sawmills. You need workers trained to operate those mills. You need transportation infrastructure. You need drying facilities. You need the entire supply chain. And right now, as I said, American sawmills are running at just 64% capacity, and that number is declining. So in the meantime, while we wait for this domestic production dream to materialize, American families are paying the price every single day. I also want to talk about what Canada is doing in response, because this is important context. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a major support package for the Canadian lumber and steel industries. Canada committed $700 million in loan guarantees and $500 million for long-term support to help Canadian lumber companies diversify their export markets. Carney was very direct about the situation. He said the decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the U.S. is now over. He pointed out that 90% of Canada's lumber exports, 90% of their aluminum exports, and 90% of their steel exports were all going to a single market, the United States. And he said those strengths have now become vulnerabilities. So Canada is actively working to find new buyers for their lumber. They're cutting freight rates for moving lumber across their own country by 50%. They're building new trade relationships. And here's what that means for America long term. If Canada successfully diversifies away from selling lumber to the United States, and they find reliable buyers in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, then when we eventually need that Canadian lumber again, and we will need it, the supply might not be there, the relationships might not be there, the favorable pricing might not be there. We could be looking at a permanent structural shift in the North American lumber market that leaves America in a worse position than when this all started. Now, let me give you the 30,000-foot view of what this means for the U.S. economy. The Tax Foundation calls the Trump tariffs the largest U.S. tax increase. As a percentage of GDP since 1993, the Budget Lab at Yale estimates that overall construction sector output could fall by 4.1% over the next 3 years due to tariffs. The housing shortage in America is real. It is severe. Multiple estimates put the gap anywhere from 3.7 million to 7 million units, depending on how you count it. And we are now actively making that shortage worse by making it more expensive to build. So I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Does this make sense? Does it make sense to claim you want to lower housing costs on day one of your presidency and then impose tariffs that the National Association of Home Builders, the Brookings Institution, the Center for American Progress, Yale's Budget Lab, and every major housing economist in the country says will raise housing costs and reduce the number of homes being built? Because I don't think it does. And I don't think this is a partisan issue either. Housing affordability affects everyone. It doesn't matter if you voted red or blue. When your rent goes up by $200 a month because there aren't enough homes being built, that's money out of your pocket, regardless of your politics. And when the dream of home ownership keeps getting pushed further and further out of reach for young Americans, that's a failure that transcends party lines. Hey, if you're still with me this far into the video, first of all, thank you. I truly appreciate you. But second, do me a huge favor and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Share it with that friend who's been trying to buy a house. Share it with that family member who's been complaining about how expensive everything is. Share it with anyone who cares about the future of this country, because the more people understand what's actually happening with these tariffs, the more pressure there will be on policymakers to fix it. And while you're at it, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you never miss another video like this one. Now, let me close with this because I think it's the most important point of all. The Brookings Institution said it best when they wrote that the Trump administration's recent tariff actions expose a growing contradiction. On one hand, at every level of government, there are efforts underway to lower the cost of housing and expand supply, from the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit to block grants that support housing and zoning reforms, to infrastructure investments designed to encourage new construction. And on the other hand, tariffs on the very materials required to build new homes are cutting against all of those efforts, adding costs and slowing production. And if the administration truly aims to make housing more affordable, then trade policy needs to support housing policy, not work against it. And that's not my opinion. That's the conclusion of some of the most respected economic institutions in the country. So here's where we stand in early 2026. Canadian softwood lumber faces total duties exceeding 45%. The Supreme Court struck down IEEPA tariffs, but Section 232 lumber tariffs remain in effect. Kitchen cabinet tariffs have jumped to 50%. Furniture tariffs are at 30%. An estimated 450,000 fewer homes will be built over the next 5 years. Because of these costs, The average new home costs anywhere from $9,200 to $17,500 more because of tariffs. The housing shortage is getting worse, not better, and American families and small builders are bearing the brunt of all of it. And the promised ramp up of domestic lumber production has not materialized in any meaningful way because expanding an entire industry doesn't happen overnight, no matter how many executive orders you sign. America, we need to talk about this. We need to be honest about this. The claim that we don't need Canada's lumber has been tested by reality, and reality has delivered its verdict. We do need that lumber. And until we have a real plan to replace it, these tariffs are not protecting us, they're punishing us. That is the truth. That is the real breaking news. And I hope this video helped you understand exactly what's at stake. I'm going to keep covering this story as it develops because it is far from over. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure those notifications are on, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there, America.